Is that
Yeah,
right?
so SBF had given Michael Lewis just a lot of research, right? He had given him multiple interviews on all of this, and Michael Lewis spends a couple years doing research on a book, and so he got to see like a whole bunch of stuff. And then obviously FTX collapsed, and SBF hopefully is going to jail and everything. So he writes The Rise and Fall of a New Tycoon, and that's the name of the book. So I'm very excited to read that book.
That's incredible. So I guess the lesson learned is if Michael Lewis starts following you around, it's maybe time to start slowing your roll a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe reel it in, you know?
Believe it.
Okay. Eshan, welcome back. Episode 5.
It's awesome.
And welcome to everybody listening. This is the DFI Podcast, where we go deep on Web3 infrastructure, services, use cases. And I'm joined today by my fabulous co-host, Eshan Cordia. And today we're going to go into some high-level news topics of what's going on the past week with Web3. And then we've got some deeper dives later this episode. We're going to go into why we care about this space.
Yeah, I'm excited that we're throwing in different topics every week, you know, moving from
Keeping it fresh
to news to, you know, personal motivations. It's exciting for all the listeners. We are planning on bringing guests who are experts in different fields like NFTs, traditional finance, DAOs, decentralized science, and more. So I'm super pumped for that. And so hopefully over the next month, we'll see some guests on the pod.
No doubt. All right. Well, let's jump right into it. I'm going to share my screen real quick here for a couple of high-level topics. Interestingly, Eshan, I don't know if you heard about this little insurrection that happened last week.
Yeah.
This minor activity, this Wagner group, which is interesting in a variety of reasons, because they're basically mercenaries. They're basically a group that the Russian government has paid to come in. And really good meme about not using mercenaries in your military, but they ended up being able to squash it. But interestingly, the Russian transition between crypto, specifically a stablecoin named Tether, and the ruble skyrocketed during this time of the rebellion, which says something about maybe people's behavior in scary times for their currency. I don't know. How do you interpret that, Eshan?
Yeah. So for people who are listening and not watching, basically what Wes has on the screen is the month of June, the transactions between Tether and rubles. And Tether is a stable coin. And it's pretty the same pretty much every day. And then when the news broke out for when the Wagner group marched on Russia, it jumps up from about 3 to 4 million a day to almost 15 million a day. And so that's kind of what we're looking at. I think there are two things. One, interestingly enough, I think the Wagner group looked really strong in this because they were basically able to, you know, take over Russian military operations or positions, military bases rather, and kind of march until Putin had to make a deal. I can't remember the last time I saw Putin made a deal like this. He puts people in jail for, you know, saying the slightest things, shuts down media operations if they say anything that could be considered anti-Putin. Yet the Wagner group leader, and I don't know how to pronounce his name, so I won't try, gets a deal to go to Belarus. So I think we're going to hear more. There's more to the story here. But in terms of crypto, I think this is interesting because one of the selling points of crypto has always been that if governments are not managing their like monetary policy, currency, and financials well, crypto is a great use case. And I think one of the reasons why it has not picked up in the US for a whole bunch of, you know, like platforms like lending and other stuff, and it has abroad, is because the US government historically, or at least in the last, you know, decade or two, has shown competency. The Federal Reserve has shown competency. Right now, you can argue about whether the Fed was too slow on inflation, but in general, you know, there is a trust with the US government that, you know, there are US laws, et cetera. So I think there's one of the strengths of cryptocurrency is that, and one of the reasons why governments are scared is that for governments who manage their cash poorly, their currency poorly, you know, et cetera, this is going to be like a real threat to them. And there are countries in the world like Sri Lanka, Pakistan, you know, Russia today, Turkey, right? That where a lot of stable coins are being used and people are trading their local currency for stable coins as soon as they can. And generally those stable coins are, stable to the USD. So yeah, those, I think high level, like those are some of my thoughts on this whole stable coin thing.
I agree. It's hard to appreciate the concept of a plan B until you need a plan B. And in the US, we really haven't needed a plan B. But the thing that's easy to forget, I forget this all the time, is that cryptocurrency and Web3 are a global phenomenon. And it's not always just about the US. And so each country is going to deal with it in its own way. So it's interesting to see how the dynamics play out over time there.
Yeah. Mentioning about each country dealing with its own way, do you want to move to the Japan news?
Yes.
Yeah. So Japan has, in general, pretty strict laws around cryptocurrency, right? Like you still have to pay 55% income tax on crypto if you make profits, which is a lot higher than India, which is like 30%. And the US, as of right now, you have like long-term and short-term capital gains. But Japan just announced that companies that issue tokens, so like decentralized networks and others who issue tokens, do not have to pay. They're exempted from like corporate taxes on unrealized cryptocurrency gains, which makes sense. I never understood the concept of taxing unrealized gains to begin with, right? Because in reality, it's paper money, not real money until you turn it into cash or bonds. What were your thoughts on that, Wes?
I think it's a good example of just Asia becoming more friendly to crypto generally, because it is a competitive global market to bring businesses there. You've got Hong Kong opening up softer legislation towards crypto, Singapore becoming a hub. And so Japan is seeing all these things firsthand. I think it's a great opportunity for them to bring in more business to the Japanese. There was, I think ETH Tokyo was a big conference that happened late last year there. They have a burgeoning community. They have every ability to be competitive in this space, and tax policy is a big part of it. Smart.
Yeah, I think this is actually a win for like Web3 everywhere, because what's going to happen is that every country now is going to see, okay, well, Hong Kong is doing this, Japan is doing this, the UK is doing this. Like, what do I need to do so that people don't leave, my country to go work in one of these countries in crypto, right? So like, I feel that, and obviously Singapore has some crypto laws. So I feel that like, as more and more countries see other countries passing bills to make crypto innovation easier in their country, more countries will want in. And I think, just like we were late to chips, but that eventually the government got their act together and passed the chips bill, right? And I think historically the US has been more like a wait and see approach because the market's so big and we have so many people, right? I think over time, like we will see the European Union and the US just like change their position and pass legislation that will support crypto innovation in their respective countries.
That would be lovely, especially being a U.S. citizen. I'd love to continue operating in crypto in a fully legal manner. But what's interesting is thinking about how much the U.S. has at stake as the global reserve currency and the largest, let's say, financial market in the world. It makes me wonder a little bit, like to some extent, has the U.S. been slow on crypto policy because it has the most to lose? There was a comment that someone made on Twitter the other day, which was, with BlackRock going into this new ETF and opening up that for folks, the retirement account, just retail investors, their retirement accounts, 401ks, IRA, they were estimating it's like maybe $30 trillion worth of assets. And if those assets could then flow into an ETF for crypto, just as an example, if the US were more friendly to, does that impact other assets? Does that value flow away from those assets into crypto as a result? Is it like a watershed moment? Do you think that's the case at all? Or do you think it's
that's interesting? I think there's two parts to what you just said, which I'd like to break down. One, I don't believe that anyone in the government believes that crypto is a threat to the US dollar and the threat to the US dollar as the reserve currency of the world. I haven't heard anyone at any of the central banks mention that they're scared of crypto in that sense, right? So I don't know if I believe that. It just doesn't make like logical sense to me from like a normal like use case for a person, right? I do believe that crypto is a threat especially stable coins, is a threat to incumbents, like financial companies who are incumbents today. MasterCard, Visa, PayPal, Stripe, maybe not Stripe. Stripe might be a bad example, but the others, right? Anyone who's in banking or payment processing, really. But what you said is interesting is that, like, there are a limited amount of dollars, whatever that dollar value might be. And, if they're flowing into crypto, that means they're not flowing into somewhere else. So it is a threat to someone who has assets in the public markets, right? Probably not like, Fortune 500 companies, because the S&P 500 is generally like, considered probably the best, in general, the best investment, the safest investment. But it is a threat to some people who have assets in the public markets, right? I'm not sure who that is, but, so it could be that there's a lot of like lobbying in Congress by these people who have assets in public markets to not have crypto regulated, which I think is actually pretty interesting. But I think I think Fidelity is also announcing a Bitcoin ETF. If I don't know if that's true or not, but I saw something about that. If these big institutional investors start introducing ETFs for their investors and for their clients, I think, some people it's just going to pick up, because the US government doesn't necessarily, want to be able to tell like Blackstone, like, hey, no, this is like a bad idea or whatever, right? Like, if it's going to help US investors, it's going to help US investors.
That's true. Fair point. I agree. Well, should we chat about Brazil?
Yeah. Yeah. We're on a roll with like the different stuff that's happening in different countries right now, right?
I love it.
So I guess the news in Brazil was, and this is like a single use case, but a hospital in the Brazilian state has become the first hospital in the nation to accept crypto payments. And I believe is it only Bitcoin? Do you know? I actually don't know.
Let's find out. Yeah, it looks like BTC is kind of the primary one there. They're referring to it as the largest adoption of crypto in Brazil. Rolante.
Yeah.
What is Rolante?
I'm just reading straight off from this article. It says the municipality has a population around 22,000 and has already become something of a hotspot crypto adoption. And they're accepting other cryptos as well, not just Bitcoin. And I assume Ethereum is going to be on that list. I'm actually interested to see what cryptos they accept, right? If I was them, I'd obviously Bitcoin and Ether, but probably some stable coins like USDC and Tether and, things that are probably less speculative, so that you don't have to, like, if you're a hospital, the last thing you want to do is end up being like a crypto hedge fund and being like, when should I sell? And when should I not sell? And stuff like that, right? So
yes, treasury management becomes a major issue, especially in these developing nations or so-called developing nations where their currency might be hyperinflating and they don't want the Brazilian, is it the real? Is that the native currency? Brazilian currency?
Yeah, I actually do not know what.
Brazilian peso.
Yeah, Brazilian real. You're right. Like Googling it.
It's whatever it is. If it's hyperinflating, folks get that. They don't want to carry that currency around. So they'll move to Bitcoin or a stable coin naturally. And then as a service provider, when these people have a major injury and they say, hey, all I have to give you is like, I can send you some Bitcoin. Can you take it? How many times did people have to ask for Bitcoin at the hospital when they just lost a finger and they're sitting in their emergency room saying, I can't pay you and all I have is Bitcoin. And the doctor's like, okay, we have to start taking people's Bitcoin. Otherwise, we're not going to get paid.
I wonder what's the analysis or like the thought process of being like, at a hospital, I'm accepting crypto. I mean, I love it. I'm just curious, like, I'm like, there has to be demand. There has to be people who are like, I want to pay in crypto. The weird thing is that I don't think Brazilian inflation is that high this year. Like, I think now it's like 4 or 5%, which, obviously is not great, but it's not like, I think the UK has really high inflation compared to Brazil.
You're right.
And obviously Turkey has really high inflation compared to Brazil. So I'm actually really curious to see, I don't know, what was the thought process of like, let's start accepting crypto. I think it's awesome. Cool. I think we saw some great news today or this week with a judge rejecting FTX founders as SBS motion to dismiss criminal charges. I'm not surprised his legal team tried to get criminal charges dismissed, and good to see that did not happen. I am personally very glad that the Terranus founder, Elizabeth Holmes went to jail for defrauding investors and wire fraud, etc. And I'm hoping the same thing happens with SBF. I think the last thing, we need in the US, regardless of whether you're pro crypto or not, is someone who's doing these things, getting out and not going to jail.
I feel completely the same way. At the end of the day, like crypto people in general, we all want the rule of law to be a part of the business that we're in. We want people to follow law. We want, it's a good thing. It helps us all like operate better. And when you see people that are trying to get away without like skirting the law, we lose faith in the system. We lose faith in the industry. I mean, not to conflate crypto with Sam Bankman Fried, this sort of like centralized Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
But, he was spending a lot of money to senators, to journalists, to academics, to, lining a lot of different pockets. And he was able to get away with a lot for a long time. But just to see it eventually catch up, it just restores faith in the system to an extent. I saw an interview briefly with the New York State Attorney General. I think it was maybe the District of Manhattan Attorney General specifically. And he was very set on going after Sam Bankman Fried for all these charges. So, I don't personally wish anyone ill or harm, but it is nice to see the rule of law carried out.
Agreed. And on the topic of Sam Bankman Fried, Michael Lewis is releasing a new book. I think he followed SBF around for a while, and he's, I think he wrote it. He was writing it during the FTX crisis. I think it's available on Amazon for pre-order. Michael Lewis is one of my favorite authors, so I'm super excited to read that book. I believe, by the way, I believe it's on. Yeah. I think this is a new one, right? Pre-order. Yeah. It comes out. The Rise of FTX in the fall. Yeah. Something.
Oh, wow. This is amazing. What a perfect person. And so it turns out that Michael Lewis was following SBF before all this happened. Is that right?
So SBF had given Michael Lewis does a lot of research, right? So he had given him multiple interviews on all of this. And I think Michael Lewis spends a couple years doing research on a book. And so he got to see a whole bunch of stuff. And then obviously FTX collapsed and SBF hopefully is going to jail and everything. So he writes The Rise and Fall of a New Tycoon, right? And that's the name of the book. So I'm very excited to read that book.
That's incredible. So I guess the lesson learned is if Michael Lewis starts following you around, it's maybe time to start slowing your roll a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe reel it in,
Can you believe it? If the story had gone the other way, if FTX hadn't failed and we hadn't caught on what SBF was doing. And again, remember, Michael Lewis was following before all the news came out. What would the book would have been about, right? It would have just been the rise of SBF, not the rise and fall of SBF. So.
All right. I think for this one, we're going to talk a little bit about sort of our backgrounds in Web3 and sort of what got us motivated. Maybe, Eshan, if you want to just start us out a little bit for context, I'll let you kind of lead us through it.
Yeah, I think we, spoken to some listeners and they're we'd love to learn more about you and why do you care about Web3 and why is it important? I love your mug, by the way. You the best. That's awesome.
Thank you. My wife's mug game is strong. She had an Ethereum mug for me, which recently broke. So now that Father's Day's passed, I'm looking forward to re-up on a good coffee mug.
I have a very similar T-shirt that my wife got me as well. That you the best with Yoda, with Baby Yoda on it. That's hilarious.
Baby Yoda. People love it.
Big Star Wars fan right here. I think one thing that's interesting, I'd love to talk about why I care about Web3 and why I think it's important and the pros and cons and where I think the future of Web3 will be. And so one thing, I think it starts out with you have to go back to the internet, right, Wes? So basically the internet started, with ARPANET and everything, but really the World Wide Web, I think Tim Berners-Lee writes or releases in the 88 or 89 and becomes popular in the 90s. And originally, it was decentralized in the sense that if you wanted to be on the internet, most people had to if you wanted a website or something, you had to have your own server sitting at home, right? You configured it. And I think over time, the internet became more centralized where you didn't have to own hardware. And to be clear, I think that's a very good thing. I don't think all centralization is bad. I think humans have centralized a lot of things really well, right? I mean, even politically or economically, right? Like having one set of rules, having one set of technologies, protocols, et cetera, are good, like converging on things. And like the user experience has gotten really good on the internet over time, right? And then over the last decade, we've seen like decentralization of stuff come back in, and people talk about like, is decentralization good? And I think like part of the reason why we've come back to decentralization is that the internet, like the software and the services that exist today on the internet are so good that you can bring back decentralization to kind of change like technical and economic outcomes or models. Actually, models is a better word. You can change like, technical and economic models. For a long time, we were on this client server model. So client server model means like, your phone is a client, and say you're watching Netflix on your phone, you connect to Netflix's server, and, through a whole bunch of things like CDNs, et cetera, that, you pick, you stream video onto your phone, right? I think in general, one of the powers of decentralization is that we're moving to like a peer-to-peer model, but we can only do that because the internet is fast enough and we have powerful enough computers. So it didn't make sense in the mid 2000s, right? Like when people were using Napster and LimeWire and stuff like that to do peer-to-peer, because computers weren't powerful enough and the internet wasn't fast enough. So that's a little bit about the history of the internet. And I think why we're seeing decentralization now as opposed to a decade or two ago really take hold.
I think it was the way the internet formed was the best way it could with the technology available. Like decentralization is in like a decentralized network that didn't exist until 2009 and didn't start getting updated until after that. So I think, yeah, it makes perfect sense. Centralized servers are great. They're better than no servers, storing your content, your video online, accessing them, creating a social media account through Facebook is better than nothing, which we had before. So I think, yeah, it sort of grew organically in the best way it could. And actually, in fairness, if you look at things like, the way that Napster would share files, those were in some sense peer-to-peer. They were like early versions of it. They didn't have like monetary benefits to them, but there was some early like peer-to-peer technologies there. And then that sets the stage for, I think, the bigger birth of like one of the first times that we've had decentralization with the Bitcoin white paper.
Yes, agreed. So I think, I personally believe in Web3 for a bunch of reasons, but like, I think let's talk about what like Web3 actually is, right? First, it's part of the internet. And I think, like I said on multiple episodes, I hope the concept, the vocabulary, the term Web3 goes away, or by the end of the decade or whatever, it just becomes part of the internet. But the internet is broad, right? Like it's very big. There's like the dark web, which for people who don't know, they don't have like domain names. You have to go to an IP address, right? It's not searchable by Google. So there's a lot more like illegal activity or illicit activity happening on the dark web because it's not really part of what people think of the day-to-day internet or what their experience on the internet is. But on the base level, the internet is like a bunch of protocols that allow computers to talk to each other to do a bunch of different things. And mostly that means sending data, right? Using HTTP or HTTPS to send data from one computer to another, to watch videos, to, look at Instagram, to upload content, whatever that might be. And in the centralized world, you have a company that builds out great products and services, and they add value to people. And because they add value to people, people pay, to be on that app or platform or whatever. And there are two ways of generally how these companies monetize. Three ways. One is subscription software service, right? You can imagine like Netflix, you pay 18 or 16 or whatever the number is now, dollars per month. Another one is ads, which is like, you can think of like YouTube or Instagram, where you as the consumer get the service for free, but then the product allows people to publish ads onto their network, and they monetize through ads, right? They take a cut from anytime you click on an ad or something like that. And the third is like still like directly selling you something. So you can think of that like Apple selling you a device, right? Or you buying e-commerce, right? You buy something online, you pay once, or Coinbase where, you do a crypto transaction, you pay like a transaction fee or something like that. So that's kind of like the different business models in general that exist on the internet in Web2, in centralized. In decentralized, what does decentralized mean, right? Decentralized means that people are running their own servers or nodes, right? We call them nodes, but they're really their own servers, whether it's, on Amazon, AWS or GCP, or their own box at home or their own box at office, whatever it might be. But they're running some software on a computer that they control, and they're providing the service, right? What that does is that it really unlocks like a whole bunch of new technical and economic models, because we now have the compute power and the internet power to do something like that. So a basic example, and one that I like to use, is IPFS. So IPFS is a storage service that allows anyone to store anything on the open web, on the decentralized web. And the reason why we call it open and decentralized is because, like anyone who runs an IPFS node can see all the content that exists, right? And so this is like an example of like, storing stuff on like an open Dropbox server or something. But, anyone who runs a node, they can be like, oh, this data will persist forever. Like, you can store, you can run IPFS and store all the data that IPFS has ever had. And what Labs has done with IPFS to monetize that and incentivize people to use IPFS is built Filecoin. So now people it's like a sharing economy, right? People can now use technology to run their own software to make money by providing a value to someone else. Wes, does that make sense? What we've been, talking about like centralized business models and decentralized business models. Anything you want to add about like, why decentralized business models exist, and where they can be powerful?
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's interesting because one thought question is, why didn't a big tech company create these technologies previously? And an easy, like, sort of inaccurate answer would be to say because they're not valuable or they don't have value for folks. I think the real answer is that, like, the Facebooks, the Netflix, the Googles, they maximize the value potential of Web2 business models through advertisement primarily and through SaaS subscriptions. They are the epitome of really nailing that space. Now that you have the ability technically to transfer ownership to the user in a medium that is shared, specifically public ledgers, now you can get more complex business models in place that diversify the revenue flows. And so now you're seeing just the very, very early stages of this. I mean, like to your point, Protocol Labs, Filecoin, IPFS, decentralized social media, and these other mechanisms for tokenizing value flows. These are just the very early experiments. Hopefully some will be successful, but in the grand scheme of time, it's still only been 5-10 years they've existed. And they're just starting to experiment with how you can return value back to the user. And, I agree, it's not going to solve everything. I still want to pay my dentist in a simple, like native currency. But in scenarios that are purely digital, that are very malleable, if you can get more complex, more fluid flows of value and payments and monetary, sharing of returns, you can open up some interesting new value flows. And I think that's just what people are starting to experiment with right now.
Yeah, I think that I 100% agree. I think this concept of this thought on value is really important because, like, if you think about it, right, like these software companies that are purely digital have historically run really high gross margin businesses, right? Like higher gross margin businesses than we've ever seen in the history of the world. And it's also why like people in software, make way more than people not in software and, maybe outside of finance. People are always like, oh, why do like tech people make so much money? It's, it's not like they're doing anything more better or interesting or better for the world than anyone else. It's because of profit margins, right? At the end of the day, like you can pay more when your profit margins are greater. And I think this value but the value is not just created by the platform. The value is like YouTube, the value is created from the content creators, right? YouTube is really a user interface and some, services built on top of the content creation. And you can argue that, well, YouTube does a good job because I think it's like 70% goes to, content creators. But I think there are better economic models out there that are maybe defined by the content creators themselves. And like you have like a much better marketplace for content creators to make money in this one example, right? So like, I think the power of Web3 is that a lot of that value goes towards the people who like add value to the network, right? Whether it's like, if you're at Filecoin, like you're storing data, or whether you're on like a decentralized social network and you're providing content, right? Or whatever it might be. And I think the value that you see in terms of like real money is like tokenization, like tokens, which trade on, exchanges 24/7. So at any point you can trade your tokens for, another token or a fiat currency, or use them if companies accept all the tokens that exist, right? Some other things that, why I'm a Web3 optimist, right? Like we talked about stablecoins and like, currencies, people who live in countries that don't have like great currency management or books management or central bank management, they're able to, they're able to use something else that's not their local currency for goods and services, which allows their life to get better. Most of these decentralized networks are open source, which means that you can actually see anyone who's technical and capable can go into the code and see what's going on. I think as we build out more advanced software systems, that can do like both good and bad things, it'll be good to have this kind of being able to go and see the source code, from scratch. And, if people are running nodes all over the world, like in a centralized system, the government can tell one company to shut off the service, right? But in a decentralized system, as long as you have some sort of internet connection, you can't shut it down. So those are some of the reasons why I'm optimistic about Web3. I don't think blockchain and decentralized software will get rid of all centralized software and all other business models. But those are some of the reasons why I'm optimistic about Web3. Wes, what makes you optimistic about Web3? Why do you work in this space?
So interestingly, my story is that I was not optimistic enough about Web3. My first parlay into Web3 was buying Bitcoin in 2014. I remember finding out about it on a very technical blog called Slashdot. And it looked like a fun, interesting open source project. People had built this network that sort of sustains itself, and you could actually convert your US dollars to buy this pretend internet money called Bitcoin. And I bought some. I bought it for, maybe $400 at the time. And then a couple years later, it kept doing well. And I thought, okay, this is amazing. This $400 Bitcoin has grown in value. This pretend internet open source money has grown in value to $2,000. This is amazing. I have to close out. I have to sell all my Bitcoin because clearly this is a massive return. And then even later than that, 2014, Vitalik Buterin came on a podcast called the Epicenter Podcast. He was talking about creating a world computer, sort of being able to move transactions around the world and do processing. And I thought, that's interesting, but I'm not going to participate in this Ethereum ICO because it seems a little too ambitious. So I have a history of being too pessimistic about Web3. And at this point, after multiple mistakes and missed opportunities, I can't be pessimistic anymore. I have to kind of observe that there's been this history of, even though things seem overly ambitious, there's always a small group of people, even through bear markets, that believe in the potential and that will build new technologies. And it's almost like that scenario where you have a infinite number of monkeys typing on a typewriter. Eventually they'll write Shakespeare.
Right.
With an infinite number of Solidity coders, eventually you'll create the DeFi ecosystem and a couple $100 billion worth of value, which has happened. So as this community grows and as people, are interested in this space, I just don't think that it can stop at where it's at right now. NFTs and DeFi, I think it's going to expand into other use cases. And those communities are already robust. The decentralized science community is robust. Decentralized social media community is robust. The technology is nascent and it has lots of issues. But I'm just at the point where I can't doubt the potential for small groups of people to build interesting tech over long periods of time.
That's awesome. So I love the story, of getting into crypto, and, my crypto story is somewhat similar. Like first it starts on Coinbase buying, Bitcoin and Ethereum in 2015 or 16 or something like that. Don't remember when exactly. And then goes into reading the white papers, and then building some apps using Solidity, and then joining Protocol Labs, coming, so yeah, I think, it's very similar story. When you say you think that all these people were building, cool applications and they'll make Web3 stronger and better user experiences, better services, better products. How do you think about what products in Web3, what markets in Web3 could be successful, right? And then what do you think could go wrong? What could happen where, let's say, for some reason, people don't end up building like successful businesses.
Yeah. The opportunity there is in many cases just to provide alternatives to the existing centralized solutions, like for decentralized science. I don't think it needs to replace academia, but
Mm-hmm.
if it can build a base of users of young scientists that want to start their career in decentralized science as opposed to going into academia and have a meaningful niche. Right now, the university on any grant that's given to a research scientist takes about 60 to 70% off the top for university fees, for their IT services. It's sort of a rent-seeking scenario like a lot of other use cases that
Mm-hmm.
Web3 disintermediates. So if there can just be a nice alternative, I think it can actually improve the status quo for non-Web3 use cases, just being an alternative. But at the same time, what's also interesting in the Web3 history is that there's a graveyard of projects that failed because they did not get enough demand. And I think you'll see some of that. There'll be some things that are interesting, that are fun, but they just didn't resonate and didn't drive enough demand. I don't know if you've observed any of those types of projects over time that didn't work
Yeah,
out.
and that's true for any businesses, right? That's like not a Web3 phenomenon. Like people like to be like,
Yeah.
oh, there's so many failed projects in Web3, but like how many failed social media networks are there, right? How many failed like fintech companies are there, right? I mean, like it's at the end of the day, if you don't provide value to people, your business can't continue. And in a venture bank business, like when you have venture capital money put in and you have to show outsized returns so that you can raise the next round, right? If you can't show like value and growth, then you will get shut down. You will have to return money to your investors, or like, you'll get bought out by a private equity firm or a bigger company in the space, and you'll be a feature on, and you'll be one product in many products of that company. And right, we've seen that happen in like, the web 2 and web 3 is just the internet part, right? But like we've seen this happen in like, all industries like AIs, autonomous driving, right? All of these other things. So I think that is okay that we can sit here and say that there will be companies in Web3 that fail. And that is because they are experimenting with new economic models. They're experimenting with new source of applications for the customer, for users that maybe actually people don't care about, but you don't know until you try.
Yes. Yes. You can't have creative capitalism without taking some risks along the way.
Exactly. I think for me, similar to what you said, like I think just like, again, like any other company, you need to find product market fit, right? You need to iterate until you find customers or users who care about your product and are willing to pay in some way, whether it's through, subscription services or, amount of usage that they have, et cetera, like however the monetization strategies, but people need to provide value, right? And the other thing that I think in Web3 is that like, you don't want like, even though it's decentralized, like I think it's like 70% of all ETH nodes are run on like AWS plus GCP or something like that. I don't know if it's still true. I read that somewhere like a year or two ago. I'm sure it's become a little bit, but like, so it might be decentralized, but then you're relying on like, 2 cloud providers for most of the nodes that are run. I don't think it's realistic for like, everyday users to be running nodes or software, right? So like that has to be figured out, right? How do you every time someone like logs in, like you spin up like a node on AWS or some public cloud. And so like you have, and that node does work and then it shuts down. I don't know.
Well, to your point, the Ethereum Foundation has tried very hard to make their node clients very easy to run on commodity hardware. They've actually made a lot of sacrifices in terms of like block size and transaction speed just for that reason alone. But even despite, best intentions, you still have aspects of centralization with where the nodes are running. Are they all running on AWS? Where's the staking, restaking happening? Lido is like 60% of staked ETH right now. So it's a difficult balance, and part of the thing is like, even if you do have that centralization and it causes issues and failures, can it recover from that failure to some extent?
Yeah. I mean, I think in software, network effects are real. So like there only end up going to be 2 or 3 providers that really end up winning, even in decentralized software, right? Like, and maybe that's not true for like layer 1 chains because they're so unique with their, but like, if you build like, nobody wants like 1,000 different, let's take this example, right? Like nobody wants like 1,000 different companies that are doing like one product on, let's say like a layer 2 on top of Filecoin or a layer 2 on top of Ethereum. Because when you have 1,000, you don't know, like, there are just too many choices. Like there is some layer of centralization is good, right? Which is, I think, has been something that I believe in. And so having 3 or 4, yeah, sure. It's centralized, but I think the power of decentralization is that it's really easy to move. Not that there are only like 2 or 3 players in the market. It's really easy to fork someone else's open source protocol and, add the features that you care about. And, if the users and the value prop is there, then maybe you get people to join your network, right? I think that is something that's really cool about Web3 that you can't do in, closed source centralized software.
You're so right. There's a really interesting group. Have you ever heard about this group called the Meta Cartel?
I have not.
Meta Cartel is one of the original DAOs that was formed basically in San Francisco. It was one of the first venture DAOs, Meta Cartel Ventures, which is, I think it was formed in 2018-ish. And what's interesting about them is they were after Ethereum had this big hack, which was the DAO. Meta Cartel was like one of the first decentralized organizations. And they have a constitution that they wrote. They have also like an LLC based in Canada. But they had this important concept that they reiterate called the rage quit, which is the ability for anyone to leave the DAO at any point in time effortlessly. That's like a design intention for them. So to your point about that, being able to move fluidly between things is a designed goal, effectively.
Yeah.
Invest, and then if you're ready to leave, you're not locked in.
Yeah, 100% agreed. And I think there's also going to be like one of the reasons why I think Web3 is really cool is there are going to be a lot of new user experiences, right? Like I saw this really cool, I don't remember, like one airplane company, like airlines in the world, is now moving their tickets to NFTs, right? Because it makes sense that your ticket would be non-fungible, right? And how it works is like, same thing. You're like, for the user, right? 95% is the same. You go on the website, you buy your ticket. That ticket is minted on some blockchain, but if you're the user, you don't care. It shows you the boarding pass and the e-ticket shows up on your phone, right? Like in your app, you scan it, you go, right? Nothing, but they're using the power of blockchain for, KYC and security considerations to improve their own network, right? Like to improve their backend technology or their backend services that they use internally as an airline company. We should find it and share it, after the pod. But, and if you want to transfer a ticket, right? If you as a customer, you're like, hey, I'm not going on this plane, you can resell the ticket if you want. So when I said it's 95% the same, it's the 5% that's different. Instead of like returning the ticket, you can put it up on their marketplace, or you will be able to put it on their marketplace and somebody else can buy it and you can sell it at whatever price you want. And now the airlines can, nice, you found it. And the airlines now they can make a percentage of what you sold it for, right? So like, this is like the tokenization or of tickets is happening, right? So, and like, the NFT can give you access to a bunch of things, right? You can have different types of NFT tickets, but I think this is a cool use case of like, if you're a user, right, and you don't know anything about the internet and Web3, Web2, you'll never know that it's an NFT, right? To you, it shows up the same thing on the app, has the QR code, everything is the same. But for the airlines, their technology system improves. And if you want to sell it on the marketplace, like, you can sell it. Obviously, the airlines does some KYC, or hopefully does some KYC checks. The same thing that happens today, but like once the purchase has been gone through, like when you're, like it doesn't matter to the airlines who has it as long as it's like, someone's not doing something illegal or trying to blow up a plane or whatever. But like they show up to the airport and then you scan your ticket, you show your passport, et cetera. All of that happens. So I think there's some really cool use cases that are coming with Web3 and blockchain.
I agree. And I think it could be sort of a generational thing as well, because young people that are, let's say, getting into their prime spending ages, if they have purchased NFTs in the past, some of them, and they go back to traditional commerce, that becomes an expectation, the ability to fluidly move purchases between medium like that. So even though it might be difficult right now for other airlines to use it, or maybe the average airline passenger wouldn't know what an NFT wallet is, you might get scared by the concept of it. Over time, those things commodify and simplify. I remember like when the internet was coming out, people were saying, don't use your credit card on the internet because it'll get stolen. There's a lot of like hackers.
Yeah.
And they came out with encryption for online purchases. So I think a similar thing will happen over time for Web3 users.
Agreed. Cool. I think we covered everything. Is there anything else, Wes, that you want to talk about?
That was killer. We covered a lot of good material there, Eshan.
I agree. That was fun.
All right. We can go ahead and wrap it up for today. Eshan, much fun as always.
Yes. Bye.
Talk to you then, man.